Mary Meet, Annie here. I had a viewer respond to my 77 Witchy Community tag, comment on if we've ever had a familiar. He asked me more about what I had said about my familiar, Emmett. I had mentioned in that tag that Emmett was my familiar in the sense that he was an animal guide, that he was a working partner, and I mentioned that he also willingly shared who he was with an entity that was my familiar. When we talk amongst ourselves and we mention a familiar in our lives, that can mean a lot of different things. It can be a good contribution to the conversation when you ask somebody, when they say they have a familiar, what does a familiar mean to you? What's the term mean to you? And then, of course, how do you experience it with the animal that you are saying is your familiar? When I was learning my magics, we were told that at some point we would have a familiar. Now, the familiar was an entity that would align itself to us. It would make itself known by joining with an animal companion in our lives. The animal companion was not the familiar. It was the host for the familiar, for the energy of that entity. I wasn't so sure about that as I learned and studied it. I wasn't so sure how comfortable I would be about that. I wasn't so sure why I wanted it or would need it, what would come of it. I still think it's different for each one of us, what happens. Oh, I went years and years. I went decades. Yes, I went the better part of 2 decades without having anything I would consider to be a familiar. Oh, I saw friends that would have a cat or a dog or another animal that they said was a familiar, and I could understand that they related to it, that that being taught them about existence at a very primal, earthy, pure, uncomplicated, energetic level. I always thought that's what a familiar would mean to me. I wasn't so sure I needed the aspect of some entity that would somehow take over the body of a pet and become a familiar. So let's just say I was an agnostic when it came to the concept of a familiar. And then when Emmett came into my life, I mentioned in my video on the tag, he was a puppy when I found him at a farmer's market who made himself known to me. And first eye contact with, there was a soul-to-soul connection, he and I. Oh, I would have named him familiar at that point, but I'd always had 2 or 3 dogs at a time. So to have one particular, it felt weird at one level because who wants to play favorites? We love our animal companions so. I loved each one for unique reasons, but this one became one with me, right from his 4-week-old puppy self. As I explored our relationship, we were inseparable, and he was present in everything I did. He joined in every circle I cast alone or with my coven at the time. He had an energy unlike no other animal I'd ever been around, calm energy. It felt like wisdom. If I sat on the floor with my arms around him, I thought in a different way. I experienced things in a different way. Sometimes I experienced them through his eyes and through his body, and felt the unbelievable power in the very pure and simple animal, gut, instinctual being that he was. And sometimes my own aspects of those could wake up in response to that. When I did astral travel, when it was time for me to return, it was almost always because Emmett would bring me back. He would be laying quietly at my side while I journeyed, and then there would come a point that there'd be a slight nudge of his big fat nose. He was a big boy. He was a Doberman Pit Bull mix. He was almost 100 pounds of dog. I'd get a touch of a nose, And if I was hesitant to come back, or even unable to if I were that far involved in the journey, he'd get more pushy, do whatever it took to get my attention and bring me back. When all else failed, he would bark. And that was always his last resource, because Emmett was not a barker. He never growled once in all the years he was by my side. And the few times he barked, there was a very specific reason. And sometimes he'd bring me back with a bark. So early on in our relationship, that was my relationship, and I thought, aha, this is what a familiar is. This beast has taught me about the beast in myself. I can walk this world on his paws. I can see it. I can smell it. I can journey through the astral to that place beyond this world. And his earthiness is the anchor that brings me back. And I thought that's what it meant. But not too many years into my relationship with him, I became aware very distinctly, and the first couple of times not with a great degree of comfort. There were times when Emmett permitted, I was always aware it was a shift that he was aware of and had no problems with. He permitted another entity to become one with him. Now that entity was not an animal spirit that taught me the same lessons that Emmett did. This entity was a kind of power that I've only ever tapped into through that relationship, with that symbiotic relationship that this entity and Emmett had. Emmett would step back and this entity would be present. And it was challenging, and I don't want to say unpleasant, but not necessarily comfortable. It caused me to think, to experience and feel almost to a degree of too much. It encouraged me to reach into the angry parts of me, the parts of me that were absolute in intent and focus and knowing what had to be done. And then sometimes almost ruthlessly doing what had to be done in support of that. It was a complex and sophisticated relationship. There were times that, in a way, I used it as a fetch, where it would go and accomplish things for me. It is what I sent away from a working or a spell. It was my intent put out into the world. And there were other times when it rattled my foundations by not being necessarily what I wanted it to be. Being an energy that was so different from me. Like with Emmett, my animal guide. I wanted to be like Emmett. I already was like Emmett, but I'd forgotten my animal self. This entity, the familiar that shared a body with Emmett, always challenged me to be something I had never been. I hadn't forgotten. I'd never, ever been to begin with. That relationship, I had the power of about a decade with that relationship. It was a powerful, sometimes almost too powerful to deal with, because I had to learn as I went along what this meant. In the back of my head, I'm remembering that I had been told that a familiar was not a pet or an animal. It was an entity that would present itself as that animal. This was a witch's familiar. And that is what happened. With Emmett, because he was a very powerful energy in his own right, he was always very present. And as Emmett started to age, Emmett, I'm quite sure, made the decision that he was no longer at the energetic level to share time and place with the familiar that had entered our relationship. When things became a little more difficult for Emmett, just the day-to-day tasks of living become slower and more achy and more challenging for Emmett, there was a night in ritual, and Emmett just came and sat right in front of me. Now, when I was sitting on the floor, if Emmett came and sat in front of me, his amber eyes were face to face with me because he was a big boy. And he looked right at me, and he let out this sigh. And I felt that Emmett was totally and completely present, and that other entity was never going to be part of my life again. It's like Emmett had hosted it, and I always assumed hadn't hosted it intentionally, by intent, but I do think differently because of the experience of the way it ended, where it was gone. It was released. Emmett lived another 3 years after that, and at no level of working, energetic or etheric, did I ever encounter the energy of that familiar again. I've heard things from other witches that familiars, they tend to have a purpose and then they're gone. They expire, in a way. I didn't intentionally create this one, nor of course did I intentionally eliminate it. It does seem, though, that Emmett was willing for it to enter our relationship, and that he's the one that decided when it was done. I have a feeling there's still a learning for me in my life to know, just to be able to separate out rationally what of my experiences during those 10 years and the witch that I continued to become had to do with my relationship with that entity. I learned a lot early on because of my reluctance to accept it, a feeling that I was falling for a superstitious story of some kind, that it was all in my head, and it was all make-believe. But I know I was transformed through working with it. I know that it became an amazing vehicle for my intent sent out to become manifest. I never missed it when it was gone. But every now and then I remember. By the way, it expanded me into new possibilities. What of me was changed because of the fact that it had existed. I wanted to share this because, you know, read so much in books about what a familiar might or might not be. Your familiar could very well be nothing more than an animal companion that when you sit with it, you are in some way transformed. Not just in that moment, but permanently transformed. The animal companion may be something like Emmett was, a guide into the gut, basic, instinctual, bone and blood of who we are, a remembering of our ancient self, and therefore the wisdom that arises from that. And something that you name your familiar might be that grounding energy for many various reasons, in ritual or in life when you're just too wired and stressed. It could be something like Emmett was to me, that if you are dreaming or you are projecting or traveling, they stand guard in a way. Your champion of the earthly world and the reminder you're of the earth and you must return to it. You may also find, and I don't know what circumstances make this happen, that your familiar is what comes to, links with the body of your animal companion, but is actually separate from it. Further thoughts then, thanks to a viewer's question on what my familiar was to me. I wish you mirth and reverence. Mary Part.